Thank you, Kai. Thank you so much to the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion for the invitation. I'm really happy to be part of this incredibly important series. So as was mentioned in the introduction, I'm going to focus my thoughts on the UK. And I guess I do come from more of a sociological perspective than a sort of straight legal route. So I'll talk a bit about the kind of broader context around citizenship deprivation, about why counterterrorism has been so important for the escalation of citizenship deprivation powers, and then kind of reflect on some of the cases and the significance of the nature of these powers as I see them in the contemporary context. So I'm just gonna share my screen. Okay. So there are multiple ways in which I think that we need to think about citizenship deprivation, and not just in its kind of formal legal sense. So in the kind of literal way in which deprivation is currently happening in the context of the war on terror and its legacy. And so I just want to kind of begin by flagging, and I think this is important as I'll go on to explain in a minute, for sort of broadening our understandings and our approach to thinking about the topic of citizenship deprivation in order to sort of better understand it and I guess to kind of respond and to resist against the current ways in which the state is using its powers. So there are multiple ways in which we might conceptualize the materialization of citizenship deprivation, all of which I would argue are deeply racialized in their construction and implementation. Sometimes citizenship deprivation is a product of historical legacies of the way in which the nation state has formed, premised on the exclusion or marginality of those who've been long resident but deemed non-belonging or to be not of the nation. This is the form of deprivation that Hannah Arendt spoke about at the beginning of the 20th century, but it's also a form of deprivation that we see, prolifically being used in the context of India, for example, and the ongoing exercise of citizenship deprivation underway in the state of Assam. But there's also other times we see citizenship deprivation being enabled against as a sort of hit back against immigrants either recently arrived or not so much at all, but second or third generations who are prohibited from shedding immigrant status in the public imaginary and sort of perceived or portrayed as being an unwelcome outsider, always vulnerable to repatriation. In Europe, this is often most represented through the sort of post-colonial subject. And there's a myriad of bureaucratic, administrative, and legal provisions that are cast under immigration policy and legislation, which effectively enact forms of citizenship deprivation through a denial or non-recognition of citizenship rights, usually against those whose legitimate claims to citizenship are rooted in the margins in the UK context of British imperial history. And I suppose the deportation of Caribbean migrants arriving in the UK from earlier in some cases than the mid-20th century, but en masse from the mid-20th century and beyond, who are referred to usually as the Windrush generation, and their descendants is the most iconic example. And this is not to say that the two forms of deprivation that I've mentioned are wholly separate. Of course, there's lots of overlap between the way in which deprivation is represented and discursively spoken of and the way in which it materialized in terms of state practices. But I suppose there are multiple different routes to the same ultimate goal that we should be mindful of. And I suppose that sometimes the desire to enact statelessness are justified in terms of national security discourses and framed as an imperative tool of the counterterrorism arsenal required against those who are assumed or occasionally proven to have acted treacherously against state interests. So, here we have the literal expansion of legal powers to deprive citizenship, the implementation of laws enhancing the powers of the Secretary of State in the British context to enact and enforce citizenship deprivation against subjects who are deemed doubtful or suspicious. So the counterterrorism agenda has been the key enabler of this development, and mostly people identified it's mostly people who have been identified as terrorism suspects who have been subject to these measures. And I flag these kind of multiple governing techniques to citizenship deprivation here because I think it's important to think with, as I was saying, openly and not so literally about the ways in which banishment, exile, and statelessness are produced and enacted, not least because it brings into view a larger trend that's sometimes missed when we focus on one particular route to a shared destination. It's often the case that the state uses a particular policing technique or strategy against a particular cohort or population group, but these different techniques form multiple threads in a larger tapestry of violence, exclusion, and abandonment. And I think a broader key point to be attentive to in this regard is how the deprivation of citizenship will become, and to some extent already is, an imperative governing tool in times of scarcity. Citizenship offers privileged access in a world of scarcity, where the harsh reality of finite resources, the ramifications of the desires for infinite growth, unbounded in kind of the capitalist state, nation states that we live in is biting hard. And so, within the context of a world where there's kind of finite and disappearing resources of clean air, of water, of essential food provisions and shelter, of a sort of stable a stability around where we live, in a world of climate catastrophe where there's sort of less and less of the planet remaining habitable, the management of citizenship is going to become and is increasingly important. And so I think that our attention to citizenship deprivation is as important for this broader context that we're sort of the broader geopolitical context that we're operating in. But having begun with this broad brush, due to the constraints of time and focus in this paper, I will mostly be focusing on this last element of citizenship deprivation as it's being used in the context of counterterrorism, in the counterterrorism context, not least because it's where most of my research focus has been. So I'll firstly talk through the development of citizenship deprivation powers in the UK and the ways in which high profile and sometimes not so high profile, relatively anonymous cases, counterterrorism cases, have been critical for legitimizing and justifying their enactment. And then I'll go on to say something about the general spread of cases. And I want to say something about gender and the policing of women and children in the camps of northeastern Syria, who've been made stateless by these powers. And then I'll end with some reflections on why the security state has been so invested in these powers and the implication of this. So earlier this year, it was reported that the Home Office was under investigation for its lack of transparency over the reporting of its use of citizenship deprivation. While we know that between 2014 and 2016, there were 23 people in the UK who were deprived of their British nationality, this rose to 104 cases between 2017 and 2018. but there have been no reporting on figures since then. In 2019, Sajid Javid reported to the House of Commons that the power had been used about 150 times since 2010. But we have no breakdown of these figures by gender, ethnicity, or indeed for specific reason. The detail of how this power has been used remains shrouded in secrecy. And so I guess in true authoritarian style, we know something about the power's existence and availability, but little about the reasons for its application or the conditions under which it's been executed. One of the central liberal criticisms of the use of citizenship deprivation powers is the stark lack of state transparency or accountability in the process of the enactment of these powers, which says something about the growing authoritarian state of which citizenship deprivation is a part, is a kind of reflection. Having said all this, the advancement of citizenship deprivation powers has been made possible. We don't know much about the way in which it's being used, or I should say that the sort of the secrecy around the way in which citizenship deprivation is enacted is nevertheless not prohibiting the state's ability to increasingly pass legislation enhancing its powers to enact statelessness. And the dehumanization and the pathologization of racially othered people and communities has been key to enabling this. As I've discussed elsewhere, race always interactively with gender and class has been central to constructions of citizenship, not least because when we think about citizenship as a governing device, both under empire and against the backdrop of its decline, it's been integral to demarcating who belongs and who doesn't. Race and has been the sort of tool by which insiders and outsiders have been cast. Racialized differentiations allow for hierarchical classifications where some are recognized as belonging and others non-belonging. Race is deeply interwoven into constructions of the nation state, so that some are more readily and easily identifiable as part of the nation, while others, no matter whether born and raised in Britain or more recently arrived as migrants, remain outsiders. With intensifying securitization that has characterized the last 20 years and been seriously enabled by the war on terror, criminalization has been central to this story. So the media and populist constructions of folk devils, the criminalization of immigration, of Muslims, of Black people, has been laid over the progressive demands for equality and recognition made by earlier anti-racist struggles. So fault lines separating the insider from the outsider, the belonging from the non-belonging, have emerged, in which the discourse of criminality has been central, enabling a continuity and expansion of securitization and state violence, not least legislation granting the Home Secretary greater powers to enact citizenship deprivation. So it's in its legal iteration, in this kind of formal sense of depriving citizenship, the policing of Muslims as terrorism suspects through the domestic war on terror, has been a key enabler of the scaffold of citizenship deprivation legislation that we currently have in place in the UK. And I suppose this is kind of old, I've said this, and many of you are probably aware of the sort of history or the way in which citizenship deprivation legislation has progressed over the last 20 years. So I'll be brief in this section, but I just want to reiterate the point about how key particular high profile and sometimes not so high profile cases, counterterrorism cases, have been to helping the state legitimate and justify the passing of particular citizenship deprivation powers. If we go back to 2001, as part of the media campaign against Islamic extremists in Britain that began in the immediate days after the 9/11 attacks, the British tabloid press became particularly fixated with several British-based Islamic preachers. Abu Hamza, a one-eyed cleric with a hook as a prosthetic hand, took center stage as the token villain, the domestic Osama bin Laden, who'd managed to acquire British citizenship. And there were alarmist headlines that personified him as a domestic terrorist, with photographs of his face and hook and provocative cartoons to match. Numerous letters from readers supported the view, which were endorsed by the newspaper's editors, who pushed for a government response. And public pressure turned to the then Home Secretary David Blunkett, who received a raft of letters that demanded Abu Hamza be deported. Since he was a British citizen, that was not possible, but he could be, and he couldn't be indefinitely detained under permissions that had been granted in the Anti-Terrorism, Crime and Security Act of 2001, which had been passed as an emergency measure to target foreign nationals in the initial sweep of post-9/11 arrests. So the Home Secretary, then David Blunkett, Labour government Home Secretary, understood that further action needed to be taken. And in February 2002, the Labour government laid out its plans for updating and extending procedures for depriving an individual of British citizenship. The effect of this power, implemented in the Nationality and Immigration Act of 2002, was to expand the grounds for removal of citizenship to include any person, including birthright citizens, who have done anything serious, or who are deemed to have done anything seriously prejudicial to the vital interests of the United Kingdom or a British overseas territory. This maneuver laid the grounds for a much more expansive and absolute basis upon which a person could be expelled. Sufficiently vague and all-encompassing in its meaning, this came to be officially known as the Hamza Amendment, his name that it was passed. He became the first target. He was the person upon whom the legislation's efficiency and aptitude was tested, and this route was used in order to kind of quash or quell the sort of public alarm at Abu Hamza's presence in the UK. But over the next 12 years, the legislation has been continuously enhanced, the thresholds for depriving citizenship continuously lowered, as several other terrorism cases have been drawn upon to argue by various different Secretary of States to argue that there needs to be greater powers to implement and enforce citizenship removal. In 2006, deprivation could be ordered simply if the Secretary of State deemed it to be conducive to the public good. And then following Hilal al-Jedda's case in 2007 that progressed through the courts for some time, an amendment was brought in that eventually approved and incorporated into the Immigration Act 2014, which granted the state additional powers to deprive citizenship in the most serious cases, such as those involving national security, terrorism, espionage, or taking up arms against British or allied forces without regard. The state could enact citizenship deprivation without regard as to whether or not it would render that person stateless. It allowed for the Home Secretary to deprive naturalized citizens of citizenship on conducive grounds if it was believed another citizenship could be acquired, effectively extending the grounds upon which somebody could be made stateless, removed of their citizenship. And so we have the development or the introduction of cases of individuals who had been born in the UK, whose parents had held a different nationality, where the British government was now claiming that they could apply for citizenship elsewhere. And so on those grounds, they could be deprived of their British citizenship. In 2014, David Cameron noted that the powers the state had powers to deport and exclude suspect foreign nationals, that dual nationals with British citizenship could be deprived of their citizenship, and that naturalized Britons could have their British nationality removed and effectively be made stateless. But there was a gap in the British state's armory for dealing with citizens born and raised in the UK who didn't possess or couldn't even claim another nationality. And so passport removals and temporary exclusion orders offered a solution. And so we also have the use of passport removals and exclusions being used largely against individuals who had traveled to Syria. And now, as timely, particularly timely for this talk, just last week, many of you will be aware that it was reported that the government are quietly trying to add another amendment to the latest Nationality and Borders Bill, which exempts the government from having to give notice of citizenship deprivation to those receiving orders, and that they'll be able to use this power retrospectively. This will assist the Home Office greatly in ongoing deprivation cases that are currently being heard in the Special Immigration and Appeals Commission, where a number of women are left in limbo in camps in Syria, and are contesting the citizenship deprivation, in part because they've received no notification of the deprivation of their citizenship, and so have been unable to appeal in the set time limits. The brazenness of the Kafkaesque legal system, which prevents appellants from seeing all the evidence mounted against them in SIAC courts in order to defend their case, is made even more so as the accusing party, the state, is able to continuously modify and adjust the parameters by which the case for deprivation is determined. And so we see again how law is being used as a servant of power, that the government is able to continuously change the law in order to assist fighting its cases and upholding its decisions to enact citizenship deprivation. So who is being deprived of their citizenship? Amongst or sort of against this kind of overarching secrecy, what we do know is that the majority of citizenship deprivation cases, though not all, have been enacted in the name of national security. Most orders have been served against Muslims accused of being associated with Islamic groups and organizations that the West has identified as terrorist organizations. The most recent series of orders seem to have been served mostly against British subjects who have traveled to Syria, sometimes to join ISIS or to marry ISIS fighters. Most have been out of the country when deprivation papers have been served, usually becoming aware of the Home Secretary's decision months after the order has been made, making it difficult, as I was just saying, to appeal at best and often impossible. Though Shamima Begum is the most famous case and has been a kind of poster girl for the media, she's only one of several British women now stateless in a refugee camp in Syria. In 2017, there was another British Bangladeshi woman that was stripped of her citizenship in similar circumstances, and there are several other cases currently going through SIAC, the Special Immigration Appeals Commission. The second Bangladeshi woman was detained by Turkish authorities along with her 2 children. And the British government, again, in her case, argued that she was able or eligible to apply for British citizenship eligible to apply for Bangladeshi citizenship. And there have been a number of other similar cases. Amongst these cases, I suppose I just want to kind of reflect a little on the women residing in the Al-Hol and Roj camps in northeastern Syria. Research by human rights group Rights and Security International has indicated that there's an estimated 35 British children and 15 British women being arbitrarily detained there, alongside many other European women and women from elsewhere around the world. Over half of the camp's residents are children. I think there's about 2,500 people resident in these camps. Over half are children. Most of them are stateless. And in the British cases, though 6 children have been repatriated were repatriated between 2019 and 2020, there's been little willingness on the part of the British government to repatriate the rest. So I want to reflect a little on the gendered aspect of citizenship deprivation for a moment, and the particular way in which policing of citizenship works interactively with the policing of parenting for Muslim women. Through the war on terror, the representation of Muslim women has oscillated between a meek, submissive woman, oppressed, in need of saving, educating, and liberating, and the monstrous woman who has taken on the terrorist tendencies usually associated with Muslim men. The latter perhaps most frequently conjured in the image of the jihadi bride and the way in which teenagers and women who have traveled to Syria have been represented. In contrast to the saving narrative that tends to assume a purity and an innocence and a virgin-like figure, the monstrous depiction extends to women whose sexuality is associated with ISIS, who have had marital relations with ISIS, who have reproduced children in Syria. And so the gender ambiguous monstrous figure is as much leveled at her offspring, at the children of these women, as it is at they themselves. So the state response to children born in these camps is not unlike is not unlike Western imperialist approaches in other militarized zones, in that it's been one that assumes a priori children to be combatants in need of de-radicalization before being accepted back into the UK. When questioned by reporters about the repatriation of British children to the UK who are residing currently in really the sort of most horrific of conditions, with really poor sanitation. I would encourage people to have a look at the report done by Rights and Security International, which documents the plight of many of these women and children. The Home Office responded, the Foreign Office responded by stating that it was important that we do not make judgments about the national security risk someone poses based on their gender or age alone, but by the threat that they pose based on their actions and the role that they have played in supporting Daesh. And so we see, against the sort of human rights argument around around the fact that it's disproportionately children who are being resident in these camps, that the state has sort of changed its narrative and dismissing seeing these children as children first, but as potential sort of threats that need investigating, that need dealing with through a counterterrorism lens and agenda, prior to them being recognised as children repatriated to the UK. And in cases where the state does acknowledge children to be residents of the camps, for women, the policing of them as mothers works interactively with the policing of them, of their citizenship. So we see that in the Home Office statements, which have indicated in some cases it would allow children to return home, only that this would only be possible if their mother was willing to give them up to other family members. There's a broader argument. I guess this is a kind of an area that I've discussed in detail elsewhere, and for time constraints here, I won't go into, but there there is much to sort of say and explore about the way in which citizenship, the policing of citizenship for Muslim women has been in the past and continues to be very much active with the policing of motherhood. And yeah, so we could perhaps say more about that after, but there is certainly a reluctance by the state to recognize to both criminalize children and to recognize the children in these camps as children first, and instead to kind of deal with these kids as combatants. So why is the government so invested in enacting deprivation in these cases, and what's the longer term significance of these acts? What's deeply apparent to me is the entrenched state investment in maintaining and strengthening its ability to banish these undesired and superfluous subjects, an investment that reflects the still decisive nature of law and order for preserving and consolidating state power. As one of the key frontiers of the security state, it's imperative for the Home Office and the Home Secretary to demonstrate a maintained hardened line against terrorism, to demonstrate the continuation of a terrorist threat, and to demonstrate the ability of the policing, intelligence and law enforcement agencies to successfully tackle it. Hardened law and order policing, particularly as it's manifested towards migrants, towards asylum seekers, cast as terrorist suspects, and towards Black people cast as foreign criminals, affirms and maintains the sanctity of the nation and the legitimacy of the status quo. It unites what would otherwise be fractured and disenfranchised classes with powerful corporate state actors. So, the way in which law and order is used and its consolidation through things like the counterterrorism agenda, it has been so important for uniting and bringing together different elements, otherwise fractured and disenfranchised working class populations. Public have supported deprivation when they have taken place. So 70% of people responding to a YouGov poll in November 2020 felt that Shamima Begum should not be allowed to return to UK. And in August 2019, a year prior, 73% of the British public supported stripping Jack Letts, a white British male who traveled to Syria to join ISIS in 2014, of his citizenship. I'm just checking. For marginalized populations, citizenship deprivation, and so, sorry, let me just say, so while I think citizenship deprivation works, or these is sort of just another part of this enhanced or increasingly hardened law and order society and an authoritarian state, and that becomes kind of so important for maintaining a kind of hegemonic order for the government, for marginalized populations, for racialized minorities. Citizenship deprivation and ensuing statelessness allows the maintenance of a state of precarity. So in the context of deportation, Nicholas de Genova has argued that deportation, the object of deportation powers isn't necessarily to enact to sort of enact deportation itself, but simply to have it as a threat to a migrant labor force, to maintain a precariousness within that migrant labor force, that threat of deportation is there, and that the legal powers are there to enact it. And so in some ways, similarly, the enactment of this citizenship deprivation legislation remains, is a sort of threat to minority populations who are most at risk of experiencing this, that even if they themselves might not have their citizenship deprived, that the threat, the possibility of it is there. And so for this at the moment relatively small population who are, who experience citizenship deprivation, it does of course reduce the burden on the social and welfare state, but it maintains a sort of hierarchy of exclusion. But it's an effective governmentality for I guess maintaining a precarity, for maintaining a docile population, that the threat of force is there. And of course, the constant reiteration and enactment of citizenship deprivation, the populist appeal and support for it, helps to normalize citizenship deprivation. The line that the Home Office churns out every time it issues a press statement on one of these cases is that citizenship is a privilege, not a right. And of course, history tells us that this has indeed always been the case, even if it's something that we might contest. Nevertheless, the state line that says that citizenship is a privilege, not a right, is a sharp move away from the sentiment of the liberal state, which recognizes, albeit with qualifiers, that within a polity organized in some nation state form, that citizenship is the right to have rights, that without citizenship, one is made abject. And so the constant repetition of the statement that citizenship is a privilege, not a right, is a form of everyday flagging, a subtle but frequent reminder that reinforces this populist rhetoric invested in the exclusionary parameters of the nation state and this distinction between good and bad citizens. And so, we already know that amongst the cases where citizenship deprivation powers have been used, that they include cases of aid workers who've traveled to Syria, Muslim aid workers who've worked on charity-funded projects, and individuals who have not been charged with any criminal offence, as is often the case with deprivation cases. But there have also been other cases that are not national security related at all. We know that Pakistani men who were charged with sex offences a few years ago were also deprived of their citizenship. And of course, the question of what to do with, I want to say, perhaps we can talk about this more in the discussion. And so the argument I'm making is not to make light of the seriousness of what's happened in Syria, or the question of what to do with returning ISIS fighters, but the focus here being on citizenship deprivation as a summary solution, I think is important because it has the effect of dislocating Britain from a war and military violence in which it's been deeply culpable. So after all, to strip citizenship in this context is to say is to say symbolically that since the person has acted against the interests of the nation, they cannot be legitimately of the nation. This is its populist appeal. But this is a construction of the British nation that is abjectly silent on the matter of empire. Adam Haniya has articulated quite eloquently the dramatic rise of ISIS from 2012 being the result of various intersecting factors, including the destructive spread of sectarianism, the devastating repression in Syria and Iraq, and the interest of different regional and international powers in the Middle East. And Britain has played a deep role, both historic and contemporary, in cultivating the conditions that have allowed a movement such as ISIS to flourish. The disaffected youth that are returning to Britain's shores or wanting to return are in part a product of its own making. Citizenship as a tool of governance then is bound up with contradictions, not least because it's a state-granted power that in turn offers some protection from the worst excesses of state violence. And I guess I would just end by saying that this protection will be ever critical as both authoritarian and the sort of climate catastrophe that we currently are living progress and advance. And I'll end there.